this year we celebrate the 40th anniversary of China's open up and reform policy.
That is correct.
For most of the time, China's rise has been quite spectacular. So what are the main things, in your view, has the Chinese government done right?
It's a very good question. So, obviously, the last 4 decades in scale and speed of economic progress had simply no historic parallel. Broadly speaking, China did the sort of thing that happened in South Korea, starting about 20 years earlier, but on 20 times the scale. So I think that's roughly right, isn't it? About 25 times the scale. So that's incredible. And if you look back on it, you would have had to say, I know lots of people wrote in the early 1980s it couldn't be done because we couldn't absorb an economy of China's scale like Korea. But actually it happened. By 2007, China's trade ratios to GDP were almost the same as Korea's, even though it was so much bigger. And that's part of the shock that we sometimes call it in the West the China shock. And that's part of what we're seeing with Trump. It's a reaction to the China shock. But so what have they done right and what are the problems? Well, they've basically done everything right, I think, that mattered. The reform and opening up was basically the right policy. They did it by experimenting rather than single huge shocks. They allowed some parts of the economy to open up, liberalize, become part of the world system. They think of the Shenzhen experiment and so forth, before others. They learnt from this with many experiments in allowing greater private initiative and greater individual initiative and greater local government initiative. All that, I think, was very sensible. When things went wrong, they responded to that pretty effectively. I think they created some big incentive problems in the process, particularly by allowing the government to operate more entrepreneurially. They created some real moral hazard, huge moral hazard problems, and there was obviously immense waste in the result. They've encouraged a spectacular and supported a spectacular rise, unbelievable rise in national savings, which has allowed them to finance incomparably the biggest investment program in the history of the world. So they've built out an infrastructure across China in a generation, which makes possible continued development in railway, roads, aviation, all the rest of it. The radically improved education and the opportunities for education, encouraging Chinese people to go abroad, but even more building up education at home. They've allowed foreign business to come in, develop, expand, and they've learned from it. They've created in many sectors domestic champions, but in a competitive environment, which I think is very, very important. So looking back on it, it's staggering, and they did a great many things right. It's ultimately use market forces, exploit the world economy, but create the underpinnings in terms of infrastructure, savings, education that will make it possible for this gigantic country to exploit those opportunities. Now, clearly at the end of this, some huge problems emerged. There were environmental problems, inequality, things like that. Well, now they have to deal with these. But these are, by and large, the results of success.
And all these successes have been achieved without basically touching the political system. But I've noticed recently you've been increasingly alarmed by some of the most recent developments in our political life, including the cancellation or deletion of the term limit of the presidency. So why are you so alarmed? So have we arrived at a moment when politics and economy no longer work separately?
I don't know. So obviously there are great, we discussed this last year, the political system of China has always been a fascinating puzzle. For Westerners, the idea of a Marxist, allegedly Marxist government run by a communist party driving it into a capitalist future is slightly peculiar. So it's very, very interesting. Up to the recent period, the view I suppose most of us would have, and there were some problems with that, most notably what's called the Tiananmen Square incident, but the idea is, yes, the Communist Party is in control, but there's no one person who dominates everything. There's a discussion at the highest level, which is quite free. And there's lots of policy debate among academics, scholars, which I've seen in English language, and presumably therefore also in Chinese. There has been. So there's a discussion, a debate, a plurality of opinions, and a plurality of views. That's probably the most important thing in terms of the politics supporting the economy. The very pronounced reaction against the sort of domination of the political system we saw in the late Mao period, the period before Deng Xiaoping essentially got into power in '78 and changed the policy. Now, I don't think any of us expected China to become a normal democracy. I didn't. But people assume this liberalizing environment, this pluralistic environment, if that's perhaps the better word, within the overall control by the Communist Party would continue, and probably as China developed, become stronger. Now it seems pretty clear that, at least for the moment, that's not going to happen. The power is becoming more concentrated in the hands of one individual. Now, we don't know what this will ultimately mean, of course, but my concern would be that over time, because I've seen this many times in my life and I've read a lot of history, as power becomes more concentrated in a limited number of people or one person, the debate starts closing down because people get frightened of saying anything different. The debate narrows. Most of the time that doesn't matter, but it really matters where there are real issues about what the direction should be. Mistakes are made and they can't be corrected because the mistakes are made by somebody who can't be challenged. And you can end up in a cul-de-sac. This is what's happened to Russia. I mean, it's absolutely clear that under Mr. Putin, who has ever increased his control, Russia has gone into a developmental cul-de-sac. Economic progress has essentially stopped, and he's correct. He's offsetting this by more foreign policy adventurism. Okay? But because he doesn't really want to do economics, he doesn't care about it, and he doesn't want to challenge his regime, and nobody can challenge him. So it ossifies. Over time, a system like this has the risk of ossification. That would be my concern. I don't know whether this will happen. I have no idea, but that's the risk.
China has been seen as one of the biggest, if not the biggest, beneficiary of globalization.
Yeah.
But if, as you said, globalization stalls or even reverses, is there a risk that China becomes the biggest loser in the next few decades?
As I said earlier, China benefited enormously. If globalization ends, it's not good for China. I don't think it's good for anyone. My view, though, would be that because China is now a great power with an enormously sophisticated economy, with far more developed businesses, far better technology base, far better domestic economic base, broadly speaking, less dependent on trade, in many different dimensions, though still dependent, that China can survive the slowdown or even reversal of globalization much better than it could have 20 years ago, and probably now better than almost any other economy in the world except the US. It has the capacity to operate in a deglobalizing environment, I think, relatively well. Of course, that means that the competitive process at home must be strengthened. The domestic drivers of growth must be strengthened. It must put a lot of emphasis in technology, innovation here, which means, I think, relying even more on market forces and therefore even more reform. So I wouldn't be so worried about this, provided the closure of the world, if this happens, doesn't lead China to turn away from at least the reform part of the reform and opening up. And I think it could still open up because it still has the opportunity to become the great hub for the rest of the world, particularly Asia. I mean, if the US is messing it around, China's a bigger trading power now than the US. It can become the center of the world economy, I think, if it wants to be so. So it can actually, to some extent, lead in this vacuum. So I think China has, to summarize, room for policy maneuver now in a normal world, which are big enough to survive even a very severe blow to the globalization process.